made enough money, he doesn't need one.
I can't put my arm past this now, Saturday.
He's coming for the Ringling Ladder Series this year.
Well, for the record, it's 1921, but
Okay, I think we're ready to start. Good afternoon. Welcome to Policy Workshop. Today, completing Chapter 2. Date is August 7th, 2018. So we had Chapter 2, Shirley Brown and the superintendent worked on, and we are completing the outstanding items.
We're going to go back to one that I had tagged, and for some reason we didn't bring up, and that was something that has come up in other discussions, and that is Chapter 2.50, Policy 2.50. That's the school board governance and organization. Each member of the board is encouraged to participate in activities and programs conducted by state, regional, and national associations of the school board. The superintendent shall include an amount in his proposed annual budget to cover expenses to support the participation of individual board members in activities. That's what we were talking about when we were trying to change the procedures, the board procedures. It is then this is why it's a separate item, because it's supposed to be a line item just for those association dues. And you probably could argue for the travel too. I don't know if travel comes out of that or if it comes out of individual board members' lines or what. I don't know.
Any comments? I mean, I know that Kathy was sitting over, and I did listen to that meeting when you were discussing it. It ultimately comes down to, I think, philosophical, or what we think from a procedural standpoint that makes more sense. The policy, I don't think needs to be amended, but you're referencing the procedures, which I know we don't have in front of us today. I didn't know we would be discussing it, but referencing that is what's dictating the procedures. So noted for whenever that's bringing forward for final adoption.
I think we ought to look at it again when we look
Absolutely.
at those procedures again.
So, and Kathy and I were talking about that, just to type up any other changes that were discussed so that you guys have a final clean draft so that everyone knows based on where, so being that, and that being brought forward. Eric.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but if I go from memory and what I believe Shirley Brown accurately represented what the policy said, it doesn't matter to me, you know, if somebody wants to go to a national organization, a local organization. My whole issue was a financial thing about people having to work within a budget, and that we're all adults, and you work within your budget, and however you think that you should spend the budget for you that works best for you is fine. That's my own personal, that we shouldn't have there should be some sort of financial constraint, a limit on how much money you can spend. And if you go over that limit, you just go in front of the board and ask the board.
There is a limit on how much individual board members spend, but the association dues are part of what is in that line item.
Yeah, I don't care if you spend the money on association. I think I'm saying the same thing.
It's not in the member line item. It's in a separate line item for association dues.
I'm just giving you my opinion. I just think that there should be some sort of, so that someone can go out and get a membership dues or something that costs $100,000, or that's just my personal opinion.
I thought we agreed on this, so I don't understand why we're bringing it up again. I felt we passed it and agreed on it, and whatever we agreed on, move on.
To be fair, since we don't have that draft, based on the last discussion, it wasn't, we don't have it in front of us, but I did hear what was said. I know that this particular policy was referenced when the discussion for the procedures came up. So, and like I just said, because there were some discussion, I asked Kathy to kind of, based on the discussion or minutes, redraft it, bring it forward so that we all are on the same page. I'll happily include the 2.50 so that we can reference it for that purpose if there were to be any additional changes. But for the sake of Chapter 2, policy-wise,
We'll move on.
okay.
Okay. 2.51 was where we got stuck up the last time, and we have two options here. Option A is the one where there's a lot of language on the first one. It was, and
2.51. Sorry, Shirley.
2 point. 2.51, and you've got handouts on that one, new ones. We're saying that there's two. One of them was where we specifically came down to what they should be doing. We exempted that they'd have to be in compliance with the Section 102.4156 related to teaching of civil government and things, that discussion of political topics at meetings approved by student clubs, events conducted outside of school hours by entities that rent the facilities pursuant to a use agreement. And do we end with a period there, or do we go on and say that they meet the following conditions, and they have to be sponsored by an organization, they have to be this, they have to be that? I looked at that and I was saying that's really getting prescriptive of whoever it is that's renting it. And if they're renting it outside of school hours and they're paying the rental and use fee, period, and not get into the weeds.
Should that be in a procedure and not in the policy? The policy has to be overall. Procedure defines what you're saying.
I would argue, yeah, normally, but this one, when it gets a little, you're talking, and I know we've talked about this as well, I think, I believe making it more black and white and from the policy level without needing to go into the prescriptive elements is probably the safest from a liability standpoint. I think open to interpretation is where we will find ourselves in a major challenge, and that's why you would need to go down to the prescriptive level. Art, did you have?
Well, I actually like the one that has the period, although I just want to add one little sentence afterward, that, and maybe say something along the lines that no entity that has to regularly report their contribution and expenditures to the Florida Division elections shall be allowed to rent space. That would mean parties, candidates, PACs. If you just said any entity that has to regularly report its contribution expenditures to the local supervisor elections or the division of elections shall not be entitled to rent space at the schools.
I thought we were allowing that.
No, it would allow the chamber or the Freedom Festival to rent space. It just wouldn't allow.
It
Wouldn't allow a particular candidate. It wouldn't allow the party. It wouldn't allow a PAC. It wouldn't allow anybody who has to report their contributions and expenditures to the division of elections.
But then could the Democratic Party or the Republican Party rent a booth from Freedom Fest?
Yes, because they're not the ones who have the agreement with us.
Well, that's just the way around it. That's silly.
But just saying that the user agreement cannot be with somebody who has to follow a report.
Art?
The
Yeah, but you're trying to circumvent the law.
No, I'm not trying to say.
Well,
No, I'm not trying to say.
Yeah, because somebody can come in for the local party, and like the Freedom Festival does, and allow the local parties in there. So if you're saying okay for the Freedom Festival where all the parties are in there, then you can't have it both ways.
well, so a couple different things. I know that the Freedom Festival came up specifically, which we made an exception for based on our current policy. I would caution making a policy around one specific item, but I think it's worthy of an example. I think that what Eric's recommendation was, I just want to make sure that wouldn't preclude something that, because anyone that would have to report to the Division of Elections, I think was the language you'd say. But
I would essentially say any political organization.
but then
Here's my,
yeah, go ahead.
just some of the things I want to throw out for
Yes.
you all to consider. The one that has the 1 through 6, the more prescriptive one under G, that comes from the Seminole County policy. That
Right.
is largely the Seminole County policy. So that's just to let you know that's where it came from. I didn't just
Right.
sit down and make that up. And I think that is trying to be prescriptive and draw some lines, trying to be fair, to all sides. That's the point of that, I think. My concern with the one that has a period is you are clearly now opening yourselves up as a public forum.
Right.
You are telling anybody, let me underline that, anybody who has a use agreement and pays you the money that they can rent and speak. And we can all think of divergent groups across the spectrum, And the one that jumped to mind for me was, I know the University of Florida fairly recently had a major brouhaha because they are, I suppose, a public forum. And they had all the issues when I think it was Mr. Spencer came to speak, and there were, protests and counter protests, and I don't know that necessarily that's where you want to be. If it is, you can do it, but I want you to do it with your eyes open.
No.
So that's my concern about being just,
Yeah.
here we are, come rent us.
I think the presentation with the six is really
I do too.
So it would only be events conducted outside of school hours in which the general public is invited to meet and hear all candidates in a particular race. So it is definitely only for candidates.
Or to meet representatives of both sides of an issue appearing on the ballot. So if you had, constitutional amendments or if it's on the ballot. I mean, this is designed to allow school facilities to be used for basically debates or open dialogue, but it ensures, or it's attempting to ensure, that all sides of either the race or the issue are allowed on, that it's not one or another, it's both.
One thing that I have a concern about is number 3, a candidate who can't personally attend shall be allowed to send a designated representative. I mean, why should we do that? I mean, why should we get into that? Why should we require that?
I don't know that we have to. That's just literally out of the Seminole policy.
That one, I just didn't see why we needed to do something like that.
So for clarification, because I think, so going back to kind of what we had before was very concise. It was just clearly not allowed.
Right.
So there was no debate. There was no need to necessarily define that. Now we find ourselves, and I have a better sense of where everyone wants to go, is that the option with listing down, opening up the political activity, and then including these options, which I remember seeing, it guides those options when you do open it. Is that where we're going? Is that what the board is?
You're right. A third option is not to have G at all, which is the current policy. G was a reaction to the conversation of the board from the Freedom Fest, and to try to allow something like that.
Well, my feeling is if we're going to allow it as we did, then we might as well have it in here. Because you can't decide on a case by case whether you want to do it or not. And that's what we did.
I mean, you can suspend the rules / policy, but you do open yourself up to discriminatory responses, I would say. So, Todd?
From a staff perspective, I know you've spoken to item 3, but I would tell you item 3 and 4 would be problematic. And when it's contained in policy, the expectation of staff is that we enforce policy. And so
And I think
you're going
6
to
is
have,
the same thing.
You're going to have groups come and say, I didn't get the exact amount of time, or my surrogate wasn't allowed to attend, and they're going to come to the district as opposed to going to the entity that sponsored the forum, because they're going to say, your policy said the presentation by each candidate for any office shall be representative, for or against shall be limited to the same amount of time. And they're going to then bring those appeals to staff. And so that's quite the burden to ask us to attend events and time out who talked to what. That's a lot to ask.
I don't want to do that.
I mean, 1 or 2 I would leave in, but the 3, 4, 5, and 6, I think, they got preferential treatment, they got a better seat. I think that, like as Dr. Bowden said, it opens us up to all kinds of issues. And to me, if you want to limit it to so it would be just for candidates or issues, and that they would both sides would be represented, I would be all right with that. But I think those other ones start getting to be way too prescriptive.
I just worry in general it's going down a slippery slope, and it's very difficult to manage. And there's I think we could probably have numbers, to 50 in here and think we've covered every basis, and we likely wouldn't have. And I think, one, policy is intended to be broad, but when we're getting into interpretation is kind of where I think we fall afoul. I don't know if they're in civic organizations are challenging to define. I think, again, I personally, I know again, if there's a way from a language standpoint, this is my personal opinion, to keep it where it was before, I think it was cleaner and tighter. And I think it just, if you think about the implications we have as an organization because of lease agreements, I mean, you can hold harmless all you want, but we also have a responsibility of preservation of assets, et cetera, and who knows what could, I just worry that it may become more unmanageable than we predicted. And is that worth it? So that's my biggest
Well,
concern.
I think that would happen within the procedures, and what kind of if you had a use agreement, you would want to put something in your use agreement to make sure that if any damages happened or anything, they would be covered. But, I know that the USF and New College used to have things in their campuses. And I know we also have, like President Bush when he came in. I mean, do we say, oh, wait a minute, you can't do that? At what point do you say, well, you're here as a president, but you're here as a president running for re-election? That gets to be problematic, I think, too. So I think if we just say if it's sponsored by an organization, or maybe better define that organization.
I like mine, non-political organization.
Well, because when you mention like the president, I think there's an official capacity, and then there's the election capacity or campaigning capacity, and they're very, I believe, more time.
But like the League of Women Voters, I mean, they had something at the library last night. It was school board candidates. I mean, why couldn't you have a school board candidate thing where school board candidates hang out? I don't know.
I mean, I went to the Freedom Festival with Christine and Madison, and it rained.
I was there, yeah.
Yeah, right.
And I don't think Maddie thought it was a political event at all. There she was slipping and sliding and getting glow sticks and filling her
Like
ice cream.
Woodstock.
I mean,
Music.
I don't think to her it was a political event. There was music on the stage. There were booths that had politicians in it, but it really wasn't a political event. It was, and we stayed there and watched the fireworks. So it was like a community event that they did rent space to politicians, but to me that was a community event, and so that's why I still like the language of. And I agree, Ms. Zucker, you are correct that people could, abuse it. I mean, any policy you write, people could abuse it. But if you tighten it up by saying we're not going to allow parties and candidates and PACs, I think that's going to end that. And if the chamber wants to do something, you kind of got to trust the chamber, I guess. I guess that's what it comes down to.
I think it depends where you're starting. If you're saying that we're only renting to groups that allow all candidates to come or all issues to be heard, you could still put your limitation on it, Mr. Robinson. Right. But if we just say anybody can come talk about political issues except for parties, well, that doesn't stop just an individual, and I'll go back to the UF, that's just one example,
Right.
Of that person, because that person's probably not somebody who has to report. That's my concern.
Stop him from coming to speak.
You don't have an open forum. And that's the decision you're making now, is whether
Correct.
you create an open forum or
Because
not.
internally we have
Because if you do, you can't stop him. I mean, you can't stop anybody but you don't have to have an open forum. There is no requirement that we open the schools at all to outside groups. And that's where we pretty much are with the current policy, with no G.
So if the Satanist church, I know churches have space, if the Satanist church want to go in space, would you let them? I mean, I'm just taking it to extreme.
Right now, you would have to.
Well, right now, you can't be involved in viewpoint discrimination. You can keep all off, but you can't pick and choose.
And I'm not comparing Spencer to the Satanist Church.
But that's a good example. It's when you open that gate, it goes to that point.
Wide.
So it's all or zero. And that's, I think,
I mean, yes, in general terms, that's probably the best way to think about it. There may be
some middle ground.
some nibbling around the edges, but yes, generally speaking.
I think it's tough to say none.
Well, I know, I thought what Shirley brought up last time when we discussed this, that we were concerned, I wanted to make sure the policy didn't preclude, student organizations on, that, as it was currently.
Right, and that's the new F, and I don't see a problem with that because that's internal to the school. That's not outside people.
That's student.
It really comes down to the renting of a third party.
Right, and right now, we rent our facilities, but not for political.
Which is cleaner, and that's how I think it should stay.
But the problem is when you rent for somebody who isn't political and they invite political stuff, that's the Freedom Festival situation. Freedom Festival isn't a political organization, but they welcome political people in. That's why we're here talking about this. How do we deal with that? I think that's what the whole, why we're here. That's why we're here.
Well, I mean, that's a policy decision for the board. You can say, just like we say, you can't bring alcohol on, you can say, don't bring political on. And those obviously aren't the same thing, but the concept is the same. I mean, you can have those rules around it, or you can allow political discussion, but the Seminole policy, I'm pretty sure, was designed to allow it to happen, but do it in such a way that you're not really opening your forum to just a political free-for-all.
So can you build on Eric's statement? Because I think it heads us in the right direction. I don't know the right words to put in it, but when you talk about primary and non-primary, if you had a event whose primary function was a political debate, you would want to exclude that. If you had an event that had booze, it's not the primary function of the event. Could you build a box around what the primary function of the event was, a community festival, peripheral was political, versus I want to have a debate between school board candidates?
I'm not sure how much easier defining primary would be, as the issue you raised appropriately is we don't want to be talking about, well, did one person get 10 minutes and one person get 12?
Right.
And then you could say, all right, so controversial figure, political figure is not the one who's coming to rent the space, but some outside group is, and he's just speaking over to the side. I mean,
Well, we can't really, in all reality, it's a little difficult to stop that now, isn't it? If you just...
No,
Which
well,
part?
it shouldn't be, because your policy says you can't do these things. So,
Well,
I
what if
mean,
he's saying, I'm not being political, it's a social issue?
Well, are you talking about outside school hour? And that's where that's where I think
It's outside school hours.
Right,
and
this is all outside.
right. So I think
What
that
problem are we trying to fix? Because at the Freedom Festival, maybe I wasn't listening, I wasn't paying attention, I was running Tracy Madison around in the rain.
We're trying to fix the problem that says they can't be
I
there.
understand, but I didn't hear anybody giving speeches at the Freedom Festival. If this is all about
Speeches, do they?
No, I didn't hear. I heard music the entire time.
I've been to several freedom festivals, and it is a political event. It's fun, and you're encouraged to bring your kids, and they have part for your kids so that you come there, so you listen to the politicians while your kids are entertained as well. So it makes it easier for parents to come there because there are things for the youngsters to do.
I didn't hear a politician with a microphone speaking.
Well, it was raining.
no, I was there. There were civic. There was the city of Northport spoke, but as a delegation of the commissioners, not as a political position. No different than it would be, as us as a board.
And I think, too, that when the American Cancer Society has their walks, they...
Relay for Life.
Relay for Life. I've seen candidates there.
So I think that goes to Todd's point, is it, and I don't know how we write that, but I think that and I think you brought up a good point. You don't want to their ability to circumvent it, but and I don't know if there's discretion available. I mean, that's we want to avoid because we want it pretty tightened up. But that the party with whom we rent out to is not of a political nature, and maybe that's where
I think that's how it should be.
Can't we hold the person who rents the place? Like if they tell us what they're going to rent it for, we're going, whoa, wait a minute, we don't, I mean, don't we have the right to say, no, we don't want to rent it to you? Or you can't really, that doesn't really work?
I mean, not just because we don't like their message.
right.
But going back to Todd's point about primary, I mean, can't primary be like art, not you art, but I know it when I see it? I mean, can it be like that?
Can't you just
That's not art, that's obscenity. And
Obscenity, I know.
how much litigation is over that.
Well-
I'm trying to keep you out of that.
Okay.
I'm not privy to this, but 501c3 organizations cannot be political. Is that correct?
No, they're allowed to do political things.
I'm just trying to think if we put that in there and that you would have to.
No.
Well, I just feel more comfortable. I think it's wonderful to have community events and civic events, and I want to encourage them. And I think we definitely was concerned about the student clubs. I think that's good. I do believe that when I concern myself with the interpretation of what's political, what's not, what's offensive, what's not, and if we don't have a policy that's tight enough, I don't know what the solution would be. I think we could find ourselves debating this at the dais a heck of a lot more than we intend to. But
How many problems have we had so far? The only one was the Freedom Festival. That was the only question. I mean, but the last 10 years, we've not had a problem. So I'm not worried about it because we've not had a problem.
Well, we did have a problem because somebody
Freedom
shut the
Festival.
Freedom Fest down. Somebody said, no, you can't do that.
It was me.
Well, all right.
It was based on the fact that we have no political campaigning on campus. So I took it to literally mean, so I didn't shut it down. What I did when they came to me, I said, no, we don't allow political campaigning on the campus. I mean,
Well, what if we were to take the language, with 1 through 6 and just leave in 1 through 2? And it says it's sponsored by an organization with a use agreement with the school. And that's what I said, but then we add that all announced candidates for the specific office or for and against an issue shall be given an invitation.
no.
I mean, I think that's designed to try to encompass things like the League of Women Voters who are sponsoring a candidate forum. I mean, I think that's a
that's a good point. What is the county's policy? I mean, that would be the government property. I
I don't see them doing many forums outside
No.
of something that would be a ordinance or something that would be relative to a vote they'd be having. But we don't really have a lot either, except
Right.
in Northmark. I mean, this is really the only place that I know of. We don't have people at Riverview coming to use the football field and doing similar things. So it's really pretty much in that one community that we've had something, and we haven't had any problems with it. So I think 1 and 2 would work, and leave it as broad. And then if we wanted to get to these other specifics, I would think that would be in the use agreement with the client, with the customer.
Oh, I think when we start telling in the use agreement how many minutes somebody can speak,
No.
I don't think we would
Okay.
do that, but I'm saying if there was something, about,
I think if you have 1 and 2,
Specific.
you are at least,
Okay.
you're putting a bit of a box around.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm fine.
And not just saying anybody can come, unless you're inviting everyone.
Come on down and have a party.
If you don't bring it up for the whole class, don't bring it.
That's right.
sugar, you can't bring those.
All right, so
Or nuts.
I will do 2.51 with the changes to G that include subparagraphs 1 and 2.
right, and then you've got E and G on there you're adding? We're
Yeah,
adding
E and F, the other changes.
Okay. All right. You want to lead the discussion?
Sure.
Thanks, Art.
What do
All right, next,
2 points.
We don't have the,
you don't have
You didn't bring your books?
We didn't get a book.
We did before. We're continuing.
Oh, I thought we were gonna, I thought this was a new.
No, we're continuing from where we were.
Someone did not come prepared for class. Look at that.
Well, do we,
Me and Jenny can share.
She's always prepared.
I don't have one either, Kathy. Do you have another one?
there, you've got,
You need one? No.
I brought my textbook.
I have mine too.
We'll share.
Keys.
Okay.
Teacher's pad.
Coming and getting it here.
Yeah, so,
all right, so the next one then is
That's on the
2.60,
page.
which is Program of Awards. The only change there is in paragraph 5, which is straight out of the
Right.
statute 1012.221G.
and this, and well, also in 2, the superintendent doesn't
Right.
have to approve everything anymore.
Comments, questions? Good? Okay.
All right. 2.61,
Are we going to put that award program back?
Caroline, you need something?
You found one?
Oh.
Thank you.
2.61 is the Employee Suggestion Program, and there are no changes suggested there.
Do we have that still? Where's the suggestion box?
Authorized but not required.
Well, I
Yeah,
think,
well-
I think we ought to have one outside the door here.
Her suggestion is to have a suggestion box.
Well, then you change it to may versus shall. So that's how you do that.
So, Shirley, you need to put that in the
require
suggestion
it goes
box.
to shall.
You're a handy little guy. Why don't you make me a suggestion box?
Well, I mean, truly, that's a good question. Where?
This, under 2, it says the superintendent or his designee is authorized to administer the program. So the superintendent is correct. It's authorized but not required.
Got it. Any comment?
And I heard he destroyed the box when he got it. Blew it up.
We always had a suggestions mailbox in the media center at the technical college. Always. People put their tissues in.
The bullying and harassment, didn't we just do this? But
Are we
gonna
moving
make
to
some-
2.70?
Yes, please.
Bullying and harassment, yes. This is a relatively new policy, which probably explains why there aren't many changes. There are a couple of verbiage changes that come from the statute. I don't think it really changes either the intent or the substance of it. It's a long policy, but no real changes to it.
There are some, on page 6, there were some,
Huh?
about how it's going to be done in 10 days.
Right,
Oh, the timing.
the timing.
It's F.
We just changed how we worded it.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any substantive change here.
Did you strike? I'm sorry. You said on page 6.
Yeah, it's there.
Sorry. So you struck the investigation shall be completed within time.
So this would probably be a good time to interject that we are developing procedures for the school sites in regards to how we certify someone to be a victim of bullying, which is a mandate placed on us for the new Hope Scholarship program, is that those victims of bullying are then eligible for a voucher. And so we are going through a process, but I just want to draw the link between this policy and our certification of those students.
I could
That's all new for us
Right.
this year. We've always had a checklist and a timeline for when someone says, I was bullied or my child was bullied. Now it ends with us extending to them. We have a legal requirement to inform them of their eligibility for a voucher.
But one thing I think, even from an audit standpoint too, there's if I recall, there's a compliance standpoint to make sure if there was one site that had a high level of frequency. So
Absolutely. Yep.
So included in the policy, would that be procedures? I would assume it's policy from reporting and tracking to make sure we're compliant, I guess.
That would be on the procedures
Yeah,
side.
I don't think there's anything specifically in the policy about that,
Okay.
but we need to do that.
Right.
Okay.
But I would love to see some numbers on this after we get started for a while, because I know some schools that have had issues with a particular family or situation that it recurs over the course of a year. And there may be others that would show you something, I think, of
Well, and that's the inherent difficulty is an outcry that I'm being bullied is different than being certified as being bullied and being notified of the scholarship eligibility.
So somebody certified the bully, there must have been some sort of investigation and.
Correct. We have a process, and that process now is prescriptive in law. That includes, we have a statutory requirement to notify them of the scholarship program at the conclusion of that investigation and determination.
And they define bullying? I mean, I remember the child abuse that had to have welts and bruises. I mean.
Well, no, that's where I believe this policy is the basis for that procedure, is that, Art, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say the definition of bullying in the statute is rather vague or.
Well, it's in the, there's a definition in the policy starting on page 1.
Of the policy, but the law.
Right.
So our definition of bullying is contained in policy, and then that would be used as the basis for interpreting the law.
Right.
So are we going to have to change this
No.
because of the new law? Or is this
No, I don't
No,
think
but
so.
I'm just drawing a link between the two.
And the other one is, I mean, if they are being bullied, cyberbullied, and it's not at school, I mean, do we still have to move them from our school if it's not happening at school?
If it has the effect of impacting their educational experience, yes. And so cyberbullying that takes place off campus, if it manifests it some way in a disruption of their education process, then yes.
And there were some changes on page 11,
Whoa, okay.
but again, that was to follow with what the statute was saying.
Correct. And there was, on page 11, there was one change I need to make in 13A. In reviewing it, I just cut out too many words. On the third line, responsible for the welfare of a student of this policy. So I just cut out, that's just a typo on my part. Too much striking out.
Strike all? Yeah.
So I will get that fixed before it comes back to you. Just a little part of it. 2.701 is hazing. And that is also a fairly substantial policy. There's a couple of small verbiage changes throughout. Another change on page 2 to the investigation, similar to the last policy. And then the last subparagraph C on the 4th page, talking about school with grades 9 through 12 must report an alleged act of hazing to local law enforcement if it meets certain criteria. That's out of the statute.
Oh, I love it when they refer to a statute and then it's like, oh, what? So now I have to go look someplace else to find out what it is?
Better for us, though, so that, because.
Well, that's when
We say
they
it-
change the statute. We don't have to change the policy if they change the words in the
Right.
statute.
So we're not regularly, and then we have to
Otherwise, we would have to go and
advertise.
change the words.
Yeah.
So not a real big substantive change to any of that.
Any
And
questions?
then harassment of students, we struck the public law because then it's the statute now, right?
Wait, I'm sorry, where were you on that one?
Obviously, local law enforcement.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I would think so.
We're still on 2.7.
If it occurred on campus, if it occurred off
Jurisdictional.
campus, then not. If the camp was on the school campus.
Okay. Shirley, what was the one you were mentioning? Was it?
And then I just went on to 271 on page 2. They just struck a public law reference that we got the statute there. We don't need it now. And that's the same thing in
271 and
272.
272.
Okay. Now this little print. Reporting child abuse. I think this is something that's significant and not a lot of our staff understand. There may be interpretations, because because I know I've heard from teachers, no, we're not supposed to do that unless the principal, we have to go to the principal. The principal is the one who decides whether or not. And we go, nope. If a teacher, a therapist, a gym teacher, a bus driver, if they see a child that they think has been abused, it is their duty to report it. And in fact, there's penalties if they don't report it. And so it's an important policy that I think our staff needs to be aware of. And I think we know, because I know this has been brought up to me a couple of times.
Right.
Not so much anymore, but it used to.
Each of us
Us too?
has any person has an obligation to report if they are aware or have reasonable cause to suspect. The old language of reporting individual really doesn't apply anymore. Where it still has some continuing life is that certain people have to give their name when they report, and that includes teachers and doctors and others. But everyone has the next door neighbor has an obligation to report. Everyone has an obligation to report. So that, teachers certainly we would encourage, any staff member we would encourage to let their principal or cost center head know what's going on, but it's every individual's obligation to report.
So they don't wait for approval. It would be
Right,
making you aware that
and no one can tell you not to report
Correct.
if you have facts that require your reporting.
We had an incident last year at one of our schools where a child was ill, 104 temperature, and the mother was called, and she said, I can't get there. And they said, well, no, you need to. And I think on the third call, she just started hanging up. And she was reported, because I think something similar happened the week before. And the child abuse investigator told the school that you're harassing this mother. And I'm like, I don't think that this child abuse, just doesn't have the right to tell them not to do that. I mean, if a child is sick and the mother doesn't come and get them.
Well, that could certainly be neglect. I mean, my recommendation to people is, be sure of your facts, but if you have facts to report, then report. I mean, it's better to, no one wants to report inappropriately, but it's better to over-report than under-report. And then that's up to DCF to make the decision of what to do next.
Okay.
So the changes in this statute, or in this policy, are largely based on the verbiage of the statute. The big change on paragraph 2 really gets back to what I was talking about earlier, and that is anyone has an obligation to report. And that the list that's stricken of 1 through 5 is really more of a list of who has to give their name, not of who has to report. So I thought it was less confusing to take those out. And then we do say, under the new C at the bottom of page 2, certain reporters specified in Florida statutes, including teachers and other school officials and personnel, are required to provide their name.
Things like this, to me, almost need to be on a special card, pulled out and
what to do.
given to our staff so that they readily have available the things that they need. Do we do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen posters where they used, it was like one, monsters are real, and, and it told them, to tell somebody. And so basically the teachers there, I just think there should be some things. We can work with Child Protection Team to get something like that, can't we?
Absolutely. We have postings in all of our schools.
But Shirley, to your point, if there's some lack of clarity to certain members of staff, any way we can put it in front of them annually from a refresher, but in addition.
Sure, and this is obviously, for obvious reasons, very important, and it also has important consequences if people don't do what they're
Correct.
supposed to do to them personally. So it's important for everybody to understand.
And we also have to provide training for our employees, staff, and volunteers? What training is provided?
So as, in fact, happening now on our school campuses, as part of the return to the school year, we have kind of prescriptive slides that come out of HR that script a faculty meeting. So every faculty spends about an hour. This is included in that presentation. We also go through the definitions of harassment and sexual harassment. And so all of those required trainings typically take place during pre-planning. And then it's one of those affirmative things where they sign off that they received the training. But this is included. And matter of fact, it's being reinforced on campuses as we speak. Sometime during this week, principals will train all of their staff, and this is a point of emphasis for them.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. 2.81, no changes recommended there.
And this is a new one, 2.90, tobacco use.
Well,
No
yes.
changes there.
No changes since 2 years ago, I guess.
Was it 2 years?
That's what it says. 2017, yeah, 2 years? No, 1 year, 2017.
Oh, yeah.
Getting ahead
Could
of
have been
myself.
2 years. You
1
haven't been
year.
around that long.
1 year. And then finally, 2.95, the wellness program. There are some minor changes here that I believe came from some combination of Dr. Gerard and the wellness team.
This is where your chocolate milk comes from, Eric. That you love so much.
So no substantive changes really to that.
You know, I'm looking at number 5, physical activities, and you go use activity goals. So now we just said activity. You've got a dash and an underline. What are we doing there? Are we?
I think
Are
there
you
was
taking out
I
a-
think there was an extra space there. That's what it
Oh.
to me. Like between the S and the A, there are 2 spaces
I
instead of
see.
1. I think.
I was wondering what is that? So we're taking out a space. That's
Taking out an empty space. Yeah.
what. Okay. I was just checking to make sure you remember that one.
And then it looks on page 4, we put a new 2 in, but we need to renumber the others as well.
Yeah. So if we added a 2, then we're going to add 3 to 6.
3 to 6.
I didn't catch that earlier.
And I
Okay.
believe that gets us to the end of chapter 2.
And you didn't think we'd get there.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Art. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Todd. Everyone.
And then my understanding is next month, when we get together for this, we're going to be doing chapter 7 with Eric and Mitzi.
And we did complete chapter 6, internal staff
Right.
standpoint. So
Right.
moving
I'm
along.
going to leave
Okay,
chapter
we're gonna
3
move
for
on
my
to-
successor.
Human resources. Is there anything else? Hearing none, we are adjourned. We will be moving to an executive session for security and then our regular board meeting at 6:30.
Mincy, I need you guys to block up on the financial statement so that you guys can participate in the discussion.
All right. Any prizes? All right, we're going to, just because I have other staff joining us, we're going to gather in 331